Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. This podcast was edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is, I think it's fair to say, one of the most highly regarded American documentarians, Ken Burns, known for his work chronicling American history, culture, and notable figures. His films, which sometimes take many years or decades to complete, are often produced in association with the National Endowment for the Humanities. His highly anticipated upcoming documentary on the American buffalo, which is also the title, premieres this month on the public broadcasting service in the United States. Mongabay staff writer Liz Kimbrough spoke with Burns about his latest project, which documents the history behind the near extinction of this iconic mammal and the generations of traditional and indigenous communities which have relied upon it. Heartbreaking, but also hopeful. Burns shares some details about the lengthy process behind the film and the care and consideration taken to ensure adequate Native and Indigenous participation and representation in the film. Their conversation also probes larger questions about humanity's response to species extinction in general, global biodiversity loss, and climate change. We're very grateful he can join us for this conversation. So without further ado, Ken Burns.
Welcome, Ken Burns. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's truly an honor to have you here with us.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. I'm happy and very pleased to be with you.
Awesome. So your body of work, which is massive, I believe around 40 films now, focuses primarily on American stories, on the United States. And you're considered by many, myself included, to be one of the greatest documentary filmmakers of all time. There's a signature Ken Burns style, and an animated version of you appeared on The Simpsons. So that's truly the pinnacle of pop culture fame.
Simpsons gave me super cred with my daughters.
Yeah. And you've given a lot of interviews over the years on your approach to filmmaking, the way you use music and storytelling, the things that motivate you and your process. And that's all super fascinating. And I'm going to really encourage our readers and our listeners who want to do a deeper dive into that to do so. And also to check out some of the links and materials that we will provide. But I don't have a lot of time with you today, so I want to focus our conversation really on your latest film, The American Buffalo, which premieres October 16th and 17th on PBS, the public broadcasting service. However, Mongabay, has a large international audience, and so before we dive into the questions, I'm going to give a very short recap of the story for those who aren't familiar. So the buffalo, or the bison, as they're sometimes called, are this massive, iconic mammal, really the symbol of the American West. But over a very short period of time, in less than 100 years, the buffalo were absolutely massacred, hunted to near extinction, mostly for their hides. The population dropped from an estimated 15 million to fewer than 1,000 animals. And this, of course, resulted in a period of catastrophic death and trauma for the Native and Indigenous people who relied on these animals to survive. But the story doesn't end there. It's also a story of resilience and of the gradual recovery of the buffalo. And today we have about 350,000 buffalo in the U.S., I believe. Most of them descendants of just 77 animals from a few founding herds. So it's a story of utter heartbreak, but it's also a story of hope. And I really hope that people take the time to watch this beautiful film that you've made. So with that, Ken, what brought you to the buffalo and why did you decide to tell this story?
Well, over the decades, we've been dealing with the physicality of the American West. In the mid-90s, we made a series on the history of the West. We did the story of Lewis and Clark. We did a history of the national parks. All of them in some ways intersected with the story of the buffalo. Scientists call it bison. That's generic species, and they're kind of interchangeable. We just wanted to do it, and we kept wondering why we hadn't turned around and done it. And I'm so glad we waited the several decades that it took, because we have a lot more scholarship. We have a lot more sense of what's happened. There have been deeper dives. We've also, I think, as filmmakers and as a culture, have learned not to just sort of, even if our sympathies are with another point of view, to just sort of pay them some sort of lip service. that might be possible for me as a filmmaker, for us as a film team, to be able to yield to other points of view and present a very complex story. And so in a way, the two parts that the 16th and the 17th, part 1 and part 2, are, I suppose, as I went into it, I thought one would be a kind of inferno, like Dante's Inferno, and the other would be a paradiso coming out, this parable of de-extinction. But as we got deeper into the film, it's much more than that. In some ways, we're just the first 2 acts of a 3-act play, which we all, as citizens of the United States, but also of the world, are responsible for writing the final act. And it has to do with addressing climate change. It has to do with rescuing species or rescuing ecosystems and habitats that would permit those species to return, along with all the other species and all the other flora that have been driven out of places like the Great Plains of the United States, which was called and was the American Serengeti. So I think what happened is that the story, we're still just telling what happened, but there's so many other implications and so many other perspectives that I'm glad we waited, and I'm very proud of the film, and I'm thrilled that you enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. I as I said, heartbreaking, hopeful.
Yeah.
So, this, as I said earlier, this film covers not only the near extinction of the buffalo, but also the genocide of Indigenous and Native people. I'm wondering, how did you ensure the accurate and adequate Native representation and participation in the film?
Well, that we insisted that there be that. Our consulting producer is a Cherokee Indian, Juliana Branham. Many of our advisors, we have several historical and academic advisors, were Native people. Some of the people involved in the work of restoration now are Native people that we interview and populate our film. And so I think what you hear is, as I was saying before, not just our voice, but you hear other voices and other perspectives that help to kind of, in the best possible way, disrupt presumptions we have about American narrative. The simplest one is to say, yes, we told this story of how inextricably intertwined Native populations were with this most noble of beasts, our national mammal, not just the symbol of the West, the national mammal now. These are people that have 600 generations of experience with this animal. And the white European population at best has 6 or 7 in terms of the United States. And so what was most disturbing and heartbreaking was not just the slaughter of the animal, which in and of itself is beyond the pale, but the idea that behind it, sometimes unspoken, sometimes verbalized, never written into real official policy, was the realization that if we kill the buffalo, we kill the Indian. We tame the Indian. We deprive them of the principal sustenance of those tribes on the Great Plains that had used everything from the tail to the snout of this animal and incorporated the sounds of the animal into its rituals and used its waste on the nearly treeless plain to fuel fires. So you have something, and then you see the wanton buffaloes being killed early on in the 19th century. 30 million, we think, at the beginning of the 19th century. Probably 60 million before that, leading up to that. By the mid 1800s, there are 12 to 15 million. We don't have any accurate way to count them. And by the end of the 1880s, no one can find one. And your 1,000 figure includes all of those in private collections and little zoos and places like that, as well as a couple of native reservations. So you really see a species at the brink of extinction, but you also see the entire vibrant life over 12,000 years of native peoples being extinguished, and their connection, which is not just physical, but often spiritual in terms of the very basic origin stories and creation myths and life ways of these people, is severed and broken. And it's only now that we're beginning to glimpse a reconnection, which is startlingly poignant and sad to see, because people who look like us are responsible for that genocide of people and their ways, and the near extinction of this beautiful mammal. It's a really tragic story, and it fortunately ends positively, or at least hands it over to the rest of us to figure out what are we going to do now. Now that not in danger of going extinct, what does that actually mean? To save it, is that really it, or are there other responsibilities that we have?
Yeah, I appreciated the way the film really ended with a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm also glad that you touched upon that this genocide was, it wasn't accidental. The film, several sources in the film, and historians speak to the research that this was a maybe unwritten but not unspoken policy
Yes.
of the United States government and military to drive Indigenous people onto reservations by eradicating their source of life and liberty and spirituality. So that was really an important point to bring through in the film.
And I think another thing, too, is that when you look at the people who were so-called benevolent progressives interested in Indians, they created Indian schools, and their slogan was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And they cut off the hair. They dressed in Western dress. They beat them if they spoke their native tongue. And so there is a real kind of cultural genocide that's going on. If it isn't a complete genocide, the population, there are wars and there's deliberate massacres and killings, but it's disease and just the hopelessness of being confined to a reservation that is, and the taking away of this principal symbolic part of their lives, that is at the heart of the tragedy. So the story of the buffalo is intertwined with the story of Native Americans and intertwined with all of us too. We're culpable in every way. The United States is sort of proud of this manifest destiny. In order to have that manifest destiny, at least 300 individual nations had to be either destroyed or confined to reservation.
Yeah, absolutely. And our fate being intertwined in that these large ruminants, these large mammals are such an important part of the ecosystem. And as people are maybe moving towards regenerative agriculture and rewilding, yes, and these solutions to address the climate change, we know so much of the climate crisis is caused by agriculture and caused by issues with the soil. And so bringing these animals back seems to be a really important part of our national solution to addressing these.
I agree. There's a kind of silence now on the Great Plains. It's a monoculture of one or two species of plants that are being cultivated in agricultural situations. The deer and the antelope are still there to some extent, but grizzly bears and the elks and the bison, which were there, have fled to their own refuges, if they have them, up into the Rocky Mountains. And this was this magnificent expanse that had untold numbers of species as well as flora. That's really important. Dimension to this, I think, that we neglect is that part of this ecosystem is that you don't want a monoculture. You don't want one or two species of plants. You want something else. And that in turn invites people back. And you have the kind of Eden that our ancestors felt this was as they approached it. But their idea of relating to this Eden was to be its master, its tamer, its controller, where the Native American ethos was to be part of it, that the animals were relations, not something, Wallace Stegner, we quote him at the beginning of our second episode saying, man is the most dangerous species on Earth, and every other species, including the Earth, has reason to fear. But we're also the only species, if we wish to, that can save another species. And so there's this incredible, as you were alluding to, the dimensions of tragedy, but also uplift that are here have to be taken in the same breath, and also have to be acknowledged that this is what the human predicament is. We are destroyers. We look at beautiful rivers and think dam, and we look at stands of trees and think board feet. We look at remarkable canyons and wonder what minerals can be extracted. And yet there's also we're the same creatures. Americans are the same people for the first time in human history created national parks. The idea that everyone, for all time, not just the rich, just royalty, could own the most spectacular places on the continent. That's also part of us. And I think you need to balance that out, not have these be kind of politicized, things. It's just so uber complicated.
It is. I think the film did a really good job of capturing that complexity and telling the stories of individuals who had a role in protecting and bringing back the buffalo. Some of these were, a handful of people like Molly Goodnight and Fred Dupuy and Good Elk Woman who decided to just keep a few buffalo and raise them in what ended up being these small private herds that, served as the breeding stock for the reintroduction of the species. I wanted to ask you, about these small individual stories and kind of what we can learn from them and, any of them that really stood out to you.
Well, I think that then there too, there's undertow and contradiction. A lot of people were saving buffaloes, not necessarily for the right reasons. There are many people who got involved in the conservation movement who were very much a part of kind of white supremacy, the white man's burden, noblesse oblige, subscribed, many of them, to the pseudoscience of eugenics that suggests that there's a hierarchy of races and ethnicities and even nationalities, which is, of course, bunk. There's only one race, and that's the human race. So you find a kind of odd, but at the same time very familiar, motley crew of people, from Molly Goodnight, lonely on her ranch in the panhandle of Texas. Her husband's spent his life killing Indians and then killing buffalo to make room for his cattle. And they begin to raise some at her bidding. And then he softens and changes his relationship to both the buffalo and to Native Americans. Fred Dupuy and Good Elk Woman in the northern plains are saving buffalo. There are people in New Hampshire, where I live, that have a big herd there. There are folks in the zoos. And so you have all these things. But the interesting thing is, I'm not sure what would have happened. There were buffalo alive, wild and free, but just a handful, maybe a couple dozen, in Yellowstone National Park. But what all of those individuals suddenly realized, particularly the scientists among them, is that a lightning strike or a disease could destroy buffalo, and what needed was federal involvement. And in fact, the feds come through, having not only created Yellowstone National Park, then began to create, through the efforts of Theodore Roosevelt, wildlife refuges, beginning in the place where the Kiowa Indians, the Wichita Mountains, in what is now Oklahoma, where the Kiowa Indians believe the original buffalo came out, and to which the buffalo went when we hadn't treated them well. And there's a wonderful irony in the fact that the buffalo that provided the sea stock came from the largest city in North America, the Bronx Zoo. I mean, just, you cannot make this up. And that's why I think it's really important to tell these individual stories and watch the process. We tend to, in our current media, make everything binary. There's nothing binary in nature, right? This idea of good and bad, left and right, young and old, rich and poor, male, all of this doesn't exist. And so what you see, if you do rich and full portraits, is that everybody's moving, everybody's changing, everybody's evolving or devolving. But you've got this kind of movement, and you can begin to capture it. And then you begin to see things like the giant sequoias or the redwoods sort of bearing witness to this human dynamic, and of course the buffalo doing as well. You look in the eyes of a buffalo. There's another new herd in New Hampshire that I had the privilege of being with a couple of weeks ago, and they're startling in their consciousness. I don't know any other way to put it. You look in their eyes, and it's like they've seen a lot. And I sort of wanted to yield to other human perspectives, but also to the animal perspective. And our writer, Dayton Duncan, did a magnificent job on the script, and Julie Jumphy as a co-producer, and Juliana, the editors, helped us really tell an important story.
Yeah, you did. It's a bit of a departure for you. It's the first time that an animal has been the focus, right, of one of your films.
Yeah, it was, we were kind of talking about it for years as we were gearing up for it in the early time, as a biography of a of an animal, which was different, but at the same time, we do biographies, and it seemed important to try to extend to the natural world that. But of course, very early on, we realized that, as Dayton says on camera in the very beginning of the film, this is going to touch on all aspects of our history, and most notably our relationship with the native people who had that 12,000 years of experience. One woman, a Salish Indian, Germaine White, says to us that you could think of that 12,000 years as a clock, 24-hour clock, and that Columbus comes at 11:28 and Lewis and Clark come at 11:45 to midnight, and the rest of the story, which we are so proudly, talking about, the history of us, is just a drop in the bucket to the time span that Native peoples have had coexisting with this animal and sustainably relating to it, which is the key word.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many striking scenes and images in this film. As you said, the migration of the buffalo from the Bronx Zoo back to the West is incredible. Also really haunting images. There's an image of a man standing on a mountain of buffalo skulls and bones near the railroad. That really stuck with me.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing, which is we killed them for their tongues and we killed them for their hides, leaving everything else to rot, just an anathema to the native use of it. And then, as someone comments in the film, we suddenly found out that the bones that had been bleaching for a couple decades had value, and in fact, in the end, had more value than anything else in the chemistry. And largest industry in Detroit was the Detroit Carbon Works, which was grinding these bones. And someone said in the film, it was like cleaning up a crime scene. We left them to rot there, and the stench was horrific. We also laced some of the carcasses with strychnine. Right. So we were killing also bald eagles and our national bird and wolves and coyotes and other predators that were swarming around the carcasses. It's just a horrific, thoughtless, incredibly violent act that took place.
Yeah. So you do in this film, and many of your others tackle some incredibly difficult stories, the Holocaust and the Vietnam War, and a massacre of a species. How do you and your staff tend to your mental health when you're facing this type of subject matter day after day, sometimes year after year? Asking for myself as an environmental journalist, I know a lot of our readers are in these fields of conservation and facing really difficult existential things day in and day out.
Yeah, no, I think that's our job as human beings. I don't want to self-pedal it and say something unique, some strength to filmmakers or whatever. It's tough. Yeah. But that's to understand who we are is to understand a very, very dark side of us, as well as incredibly positive things. When the Civil War series that we made, it came out in 1990, I said, we're not going to do any more films on war. That just took too much. And in fact, the Civil War soldiers, when both North and South, when they'd been in combat, would say they'd seen the elephant. I presume the most exotic thing you could think of. And combat was that, unlike anything else, and still is to this day. You can ask a Ukrainian soldier. But I learned that 1,000 veterans of the Second World War were dying each day towards the end of the 90s, and that lots of our graduating high school students, an unacceptably large number, thought we fought with the Germans against the Russians in the Second War. And I just said, oh my goodness. So we're diving back in. And before the ink was dry on that project, I decided to do Vietnam, which took 10.5 years. And before the ink was dry on that project, I decided to do the American Revolution, which is a god-awful, bloody civil war. And that's because, you have to steel yourself. You have to be prepared to tell the good and the bad of it. There's a woman who teaches American history in Maryland, and she's born in Germany, and all of this arguments about limiting history and not upsetting our children and she said, I was taught our history and I'm not traumatized. You have to know this stuff. And the people who are our saviors, our liberators, who made us adopt a democratic system, who insisted that our education system never flinch at telling the story, it was you. Mm-hmm. And now you're trying to limit the kind of history. I think it's really important for all of us to not shield ourselves from the facts of our past, which are glorious in many ways. I could stop and make an argument for why the United States government, which has made a huge mess of things a lot of times, is the greatest force of good in all of human history. And I can start listing stuff, and you and I don't have the time to go through that. So there is that, and it's in our work. You know, our national parks, America's Best Idea was its subtitle after Wallace Stegner. But you also have to look at everything. You have to lift the carpet and sweep out some of the dirt and say, yes, this is also who we are. And in no way is that tapestry diminished. In fact, I would say the good stuff is then even better because it is in stark relief to how human behavior often is. You know, Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration, he said, all experience has shown that mankind are disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. Mm-hmm. You know, it's 18th century prose. It sounds like it's in excess, but he's saying all of human history up till now has been authoritarian. And people are willing to live under that. And we're going to start something new, and it's going to be hard. And it's shown us, particularly today, when that form is threatened as it's never been threatened before, not the Civil War, not the Depression, not the Second World War, that we have to have a kind of courage deeply at every aspect of ourselves. And then doing that is in itself mental health, right? If you don't look at the Holocaust, and what? Are you pretending it didn't exist, as too many people believe, or that you don't want to be upset by something, as so many other people, sometimes on the other side of the political coin, feel? It's not about that. You know, none of us get out of here alive. Yeah. Period. Yeah. And so we have to actually wrestle with the complexities of our past. And that includes really, really good stuff and really, really bad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of facing the hard stuff, the Earth is facing a lot of challenges right now, including this period of mass extinction. There's a lot of species now, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, that are down to fewer than 1,000 individuals, as the buffalo once were. What do you think we can learn from the story of the buffalo? What do we take with us into, the conservation movement, into this film touches on so many means of action, media and politics. What do we take away? And what way is this an American story, but also a universal story?
I thought when we began this that this parable of de-extinction would be helpful in the face of climate change, where we are seeing mass extinctions. We do have many, including megafauna, on the brink of extinction. And maybe this shows you some things. And it shows you lots of things, as you're talking about. The fragility of the planet really touches me. Well, I'm a grandfather, and I want my grandchildren to have the same opportunities that I did. And that is going to require some wholesale fundamental changes on our part. And it begins with each individual. And so I think the story of the buffalo is talking about individual isolated moments, as you brought up, of people, families saving some bison, but then also collectively doing things. And so there's I like to say that I've made films about the U.S., but I've also made films about us. All of the intimacy of the lowercase two-letter plural pronoun, all of the intimacy of us and we and our, and all of the majesty and the complexity and the contradiction and the controversy of the U.S. And they go hand in hand. So I think that the buffalo can remind us, let's just say, that we need to actually yield, as I suggested in my first response, to other perspectives. Mm-hmm. We have people, tribes here. Now 80 plus tribes are involved in the Inter-Buffalo Tribal Council, which is beginning to manage their own herds, give to tribes that haven't seen a buffalo in 200 years. Juliana Branham, our consulting producers, made this lovely film that'll be broadcast around the time, short film called Homecoming, and it's talking about the work of a man named Jason Baldus in Wind River in Wyoming, who is taking a Native American, who's taking buffalo and repatriating them to the Menominee, and, for example, in Wisconsin, and to see their faces, people who have had this break of 150, 200 or 250 years since buffalo were a frequent companion in their life's journey, to see them reacquire just even some sort of deep archetypal memory, as it's so healing. And I think we've got to understand that our addressing of climate change is going to come in lots of forms. There'll be scientific dimensions. There'll be political dimensions. There'll be, that is to say, limitations and regulations on what we do if we're going to survive. But there are also going to be human and spiritual dynamics and dimensions to this that we cannot ignore if we are going to survive as well.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything else you want to add while we're here together, or you feel is important to say about this film or your process?
Well, I think for me, I can let on. There was a bit of a discussion in the editing room that we shouldn't begin with Lewis and Clark, where the film began, but we should begin with Native peoples. I said, yes, we will. But the prologue tells you an important thing, which is these Americans seeing these numbers that were beyond count, waiting for hours for herds to pass by. And then less than a century later, other expeditions couldn't find one. That's the goalposts of the basic story we're going to tell. And then we'll back up and seed for the first 20 minutes of the film a Native American story in every single dimension across many, many tribes, and tell the story of how the horse is reintroduced to the continent, how that changed the lifeways of many agricultural tribes, which then had the ability to move across great distances with horses, and how that impacted, and then the market pressures that came from delivering buffalo, and then the great invasion after the Civil War that decimated the entire tribe, which was just for a buck, just to make money.
Yeah. And are you personally feeling hopeful?
I am. I am. It's important to understand that a lot of those 300,000+ buffalo are in feedlots, but sustainably so. Mm. But more than 20,000 are in native hands. More than 20,000 are in federal hands. There are lots of NGOs that are trying to create habitat and expanded habitat for buffalo. And so, one of the most familiar American tunes is Home, Home on the Range, right?
Yeah.
And it ought to be our responsibility to make sure the place where the buffalo roam and the deer and the antelope play.
Well said. All right, Kim, well, thank you so much for your time. And
thank you.
Congratulations on this beautiful, beautiful film, The American Buffalo, which will be out in October on PBS. I encourage everyone to watch it. Thank you so much for what you do, and thank you for being with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
If you haven't already read Liz Kimbrough's reporting on the American buffalo, I highly encourage you to read the article and, of course, to watch the film by Ken Burns. Links on where you can find both will be provided here in the show notes. And as always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content, such as our sister series, Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, please spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach. But you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 per month does help us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. You can also join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. As always, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or if you prefer to follow us on social media, find Mongabay on most of the social platforms out there, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, and also on YouTube at Mongabay TV. We really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks as always for listening.